I have decided to put together some material for you on world systems theory and give you some more specific applications. I realize that it's not probably the easiest thing to do to sit down and kind of grind through theory, but it's so powerful in helping us understand how the world works. So what I've done is I've gone to page 444 in the first of the two world systems theory articles, and I just have it on the screen here. You can look at it. And I'll just read through parts of it, and then we're going to stop and illustrate, in the case of Mexico, how some parts of this have played out very powerfully over the years. So building on I'm just reading right at the top here, building on the work of Wallerstein, a variety of sociological theorists has linked the origins of international migration not to the bifurcation of the labor market within particular national economies, but to the structure of the world market that has developed and expanded since the 16th century. In this scheme, the penetration of capitalist economic relations into peripheral non-capitalist societies creates a mobile population that is prone to migrate abroad. And when we say peripheral non-capitalist societies, we're talking about more like the rural areas to our south. And a few parts of Mexico used to be that way. And we're going to trace this back into the 1800s just a tiny bit. And also parts of Central America have traditionally been that way, although less or so in the last decades. So driven by a desire for higher profits and greater wealth, owners and managers of capitalist firms enter poor countries on the periphery of the world economy in search of land, raw materials, labor, and new consumer markets. In the past, this market penetration was assisted by global or colonial regimes that administered poor regions for the benefit of the economic interests in colonizing societies. Today, it is made possible by neocolonial governments and multinational firms that perpetuate the power of national elites who either participate in the world economy as capitalists themselves or offer their nation's resources to global firms on acceptable terms. According to world systems theory, migration is a natural outgrowth of disruptions and dislocations that inevitably occur in the process of capitalist development. As capitalism has expanded outward from its core in Western Europe, North America, Oceania, and Japan, ever large portions of the globe and growing shares of the human population have been incorporated into the world market economy. As land, raw materials, and labor within peripheral regions come under the influence and control of markets, migration flows are inevitably generated, some of which always have moved abroad. Okay, so before we get into the specifics of land, I want to give some basics of this, how they've played out in Mexico. So this is I will have this posted. This is posted on the site, the Mexico-U.S. migration timeline, and this is just a few key points. Nothing like a comprehensive history. So Mexico historic population geography is that rain-fed lands in the tropics and the dry north. Okay, Okay, so just working through this. So the rain-fed lands in the tropics was where most people lived, and in the dry north, they had little farming there, except for some scattered oases in the northwest. So a map of that, just to give you a sense of this, is you can see in this region across here is where most of the population has lived. Just some scattered settlements outside of that. This was in pre-Columbian or pre-Hispanic times. And the reason that people just tended to live in significant numbers from here south is this is where it rained enough to farm. And some of these were irrigated areas, but a lot of them were just rain-fed. And there was just a little handful of settlements north of that. Like, for example, La Quemada is one archaeologic site where there had been a period of time when it rained more, and then a little bit north here, but then not later. There were historically a few irrigated oases here in Sonora, in the northwest part of Mexico, just a little bit south of Arizona. That's where we're up here. That's Arizona. But largely, Mexican population in pre-Columbian times lived down here, and that has been true even today. It's mostly true. But if you go back, say, up until the 1960s, for the most part, this is a population density map of Mexico, these areas here being the most densely populated. And it's largely, again, rainfall. Okay, so back to our little outline. During the Porfiriato period of Mexico, which was 1876 to 1911, there was some outmigration of Mexico, and that was recruitment by U.S. railroad interests to build railroads. There was a shortage of labor in the West, and you probably know some of that story. There was some recruitment from China as well. And this Porfiriato period was when Don Porfirio Diaz was the president, and this was known as a period where foreigners gained ownership of 1/5 of Mexican land, and much of the land that they gained ownership had been held by traditional indigenous and mestizo communities, and they were dispossessed by foreign companies who were able to come in and pay higher prices for it. And what they did is they put the people off their land, and in doing so, they ended up having a labor force because you have to eat. And so if you can't farm a living off your own soil because you no longer have the land, then you have to work for someone else. And that's a long story that goes to much of Central American history as well, the smaller countries south of Mexico. In this process, the millions were dispossessed of their land, and half of the rural population was forced to work on plantations by 1910 on the eve of the Mexican Revolution. So this was, Mexico was ripe for a revolution as the stature of people shrunk, the wage labor value to buy tortillas decreased. These were really hard times in Mexico. And there was this idea that, going back up here, just to kind of emphasize this, that somehow if we brought foreigners into Mexico, that we could modernize our production, we could grow cash crops instead of subsistence crops. And so that's what happened. And so that's the kind of the first part of seeing an application of world systems theory, in that there is a labor recruitment in Mexico to build railroads. And there was a period where a lot of foreign capital went into Mexico to gain control of the land, to grow more cash crops there, some of which was to be exported abroad as much as possible. And so there was this displacement of labor during this time. These people who were small landholders became laborers. Okay. There was also World War I recruitment of some Mexican labor to harvest crops in the United States. Not a major amount in what we'd see later, though. So what happened then is after World War I, there was some return of some guest workers from Mexico back into Mexico. And then when finally the United States jumped into World War II in 1942, the first thing we realized is that we weren't going to have anybody to pick our food. The usual sources of labor that would come in when young men weren't available would be women and minorities. But so many of them had gotten involved in the whole World War II program. For example, in Oregon, working in the shipyards and Portland and Vancouver and so on. And so what happened was the question was raised, well, what are we going to eat? Who's going to harvest the crops and so on? So, well, let's do another recruitment program in Mexico. And so what happened in 1942 is there were major recruitment efforts driven by partnerships between government and agro-industry groups in the United States, large farmers and so on. And so workers were recruited in the parts of Mexico where the people were living. In other words, the South, the red flag places where people already had a tradition of farm labor. They didn't recruit in cities for the most part, or in the North, where people didn't have a tradition of the hardcore sort of rural farmland kind of labor. It's very hard to do well if you don't grow up learning how to do it. It's just very, very hard work. And so what we had during this time was a formation of migrant networks from small Mexican farm towns. And this is probably a little familiar now because you read the From One Man a Channel story in Guatemala, the country just south of Mexico. And what happened there was a spontaneous network that Juan was instrumental in forming. But in this case here, this was recruitment of U.S. agro-industry wanting to have enough labor to get the crops harvested. Okay, So one of the things that we have to remember here then is that the Mexican migration in the United States in World War II was not spontaneous. People in Mexico didn't just say, "Oh gosh, I'm going to go work in the United States." They were recruited, and they usually there was a recruiter in the Mexican town that actually recruited local people, and they were given travel fare to get north in buses and trains and so on with the new infrastructure that was established, the material links of world systems theory that you may have read about already. And so these networks then meant that first it was young men, and then maybe there were cousins and so on over time. And so you had these mass flows of people back and forth seasonally. So they would go up and work, and then almost all of them will go back home every year. Now, you might recall that World War II didn't end in 1945, uh, and yet or it did end rather in 1945. But you might note up here that the Bracero networks continued through 1964. So in our next presentation here, we're going to talk a little bit about that and go back to world systems theory again.